Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly landmark constitutional court decision that tests the very limits of our fundamental freedoms. We are looking at the 2003 South African case of De Reuck versus the Director of Public Prosecutions. And listen, this isn't just some dry legal dispute. It's a profound exploration of what actually happens when absolute rights collide with the darkest corners of society. Let's kick things off with a pretty provocative question. When can a democracy actually legally limit your fundamental constitutional rights? I mean, how does a free, open society balance our individual liberties against the absolute duty to protect its most vulnerable citizens? In any democracy, rights like freedom of speech and privacy are fiercely cherished, but are they absolute? This case pushes that exact boundary to its breaking point. To figure that out, we're going to follow this roadmap today. We'll start with the constitutional clash, define the exact offense, look at the challenge to the ban, weigh the balancing act, and finally reveal the verdict. All right, jumping right into part one, the constitutional clash between De Reuck and the state. So here's the setup. Tasco Luc De Reuck, a film producer, found himself facing charges under Section 27 of the 1996 Films and Publications Act for possessing and importing child pornography. But instead of just fighting the facts of his specific case, he took a much bolder route. He went ahead and challenged the constitutionality of the law itself, basically arguing that the state's blanket ban was fundamentally flawed and legally overbroad. He anchored his argument on three foundational constitutional rights that he claimed were being unjustly limited. First up, the right to equality under Section 9. Second, the right to freedom of expression under Section 16, which, as you know, includes artistic creativity. And third, the right to privacy under Section 14, protecting what we consume in the absolute inner sanctum of our own homes. Moving on to Section 2, let's define the offense. What exactly is bond here? Well, the court didn't just use a vague blanket term. They objectively defined it, specifying that it applies to explicit visual depictions meant to arouse erotic rather than aesthetic feelings. It specifically hones in on the predominant purpose of the image. If that primary purpose, when viewed objectively, is to stimulate the audience erotically instead of aesthetically, boom, it falls right under the strict legal umbrella. Now, here is where things get really fascinating. The law actually covers pseudo-photographs, meaning completely imaginary virtual creations, and a person under 18 doesn't even have to be a real living child. This adds a wild layer to the freedom of expression argument, right? The applicant basically asked, look, if no real living child was actually harmed to create an imaginary, digitally generated image, why on earth is just possessing it a crime? How can the state ban a product of pure imagination? To answer that, the courts have to follow a very strict three-step objective procedure to see if an image crosses the line. Step 1, view it objectively through the eyes of a reasonable viewer. Step 2, figure out if the predominant purpose is erotic. And Step 3, verify that it explicitly depicts specific prohibited acts like a child engaged in sexual conduct. This totally removes any subjective personal guesswork from the equation. Okay, Section 3, challenging the ban and weighing the arguments. Let's look at the equality challenge. The applicant argued it was totally irrational that someone merely possessing this material faced incredibly strict penalties without any access to standard artistic or scientific defenses. Meanwhile, someone distributing a broader range of unclassified materials could actually argue for exemptions under a different section, Section 28. He claimed this was just a completely unfair, irrational double standard. But the court wasn't having it. They rejected the equality argument outright. They found the law's distinction perfectly rational because the two sections target totally different things. Section 28 deals with a huge general array of explicit adult material where an artistic or scientific exemption might actually make sense. Section 27, though, is laser-focused exclusively on child pornography. Treating them differently isn't just arbitrary, it's a highly deliberate choice by the legislature to combat a very specific, very severe harm. That being said, as Deputy Chief Justice Langa confirmed, the Constitutional Court did agree that the ban absolutely does limit both freedom of expression and privacy. They didn't shy away from that reality at all. By banning the possession of these images, even the completely virtual ones created by the imagination in private homes, the state is unequivocally restricting constitutional freedoms. Which brings us to Section 4, the Balancing Act. This is the ultimate proportionality test. To figure this out, the court relies on Section 36 of the Constitution, specifically these 5 structural criteria, to weigh if limiting a fundamental right is justifiable in an open and democratic society. They've got to look at the exact nature of the right being restricted, how important the state's purpose is, how far the restriction goes, how the limitation relates to its purpose, and, this is a big one, could the state have achieved its goal in a less restrictive way? So, to justify the ban, the state placed 3 incredibly heavy objectives on their side of the scale. Number 1, protecting dignity, which stops the overarching degradation and objectification of children. Number 2, stamping out the market. The logic here is that reducing the demand directly protects actual children from being abused during the production process. And number 3, preventing the risk of harm. The state brought in evidence showing these materials are actively used by predators for grooming victims and fueling cognitive distortions. Human dignity is really the foundational anchor here. As Deputy Chief Justice Lange emphasized, dignity isn't just some legal buzzword. It's a constitutional value of central significance that informs every single other right. Society absolutely must safeguard children from materials that severely devalue their inherent worth. The degradation of kids through these materials feeds into a culture that objectifies them, making their protection a paramount state interest. Now, what about those less restrictive means? The applicant argued that there should be a blanket legitimate purpose defense, basically letting academics or documentary filmmakers possess this material without being treated like criminals. But the court countered that a safety valve actually already exists. Under Section 22, individuals can formally apply to the Film and Publication Board for a specific exemption if they have a truly bona fide reason. The court pointed out that offering a blanket legitimate purpose defense is just way too risky. Why? Because evaluating someone's internal motives in a trial is incredibly difficult. If that loophole existed, predators could so easily set up fake research projects as a cover. It would force the prosecution to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the accused had an unhealthy interest. That is a massive evidentiary burden, and it would completely undermine the law's core purpose, leaving vulnerable kids totally exposed. And that brings us to Section 5, the final verdict. The court's conclusion. The court laid out a highly logical breakdown for its ruling. Yes, expression is limited, but they noted this specific type of material sits on the very, very periphery of protected speech. It's of little value. Yes, privacy is limited, but the severe risk of harm to children easily justifies reaching into the private sphere. And finally, because genuine researchers can still apply for those Section 22 exemptions, the limitations are highly proportional to the core goal of protecting child dignity. Ultimately, the Constitutional Court maintained its objective stance. They ruled that the imperative to protect human dignity far outweighs the peripheral limitations on expression and privacy. The appeal was dismissed. The state's fundamental obligation to protect children from degradation, abuse, and any ongoing risk of harm was simply too important to strike down this law. So I want to leave you with this final thought as we wrap up this explainer. It really makes you reflect on how a society defines the absolute boundaries of its most cherished freedoms. In the balance of democracy, whose rights truly weigh the heaviest? When our individual privacy and our freedom of expression directly clash with the safety and dignity of the most vulnerable among us, well, the scales have to tip somewhere. Thanks so much for joining me today. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.